Day 4 Virtual Summit. We have successfully completed our 3 days of Virtual Summit 2026, and now we are in day 4. So, yes, before you start your presentation, I would like to introduce you to the audience. So, welcome on stage Dr. Violet Wilson Barnes. So, she is a scholar, practitioner of spiritual care and leadership development who explores how leaders are formed and how they responsibly carry influence and power. With over 2 decades of executive leadership across nonprofit and academic institutions, she integrates clinical spiritual care, coaching, and scholarship to advance ethical, purpose driven leadership. Grounded in the belief that leadership reflects one's inner life, her work focuses on cultivating accountability and healing center leadership practices, and she is from United States of America. So welcome on stage. So the stage is all yours. Good luck.
Oh, thank you so much, Melinda, for that warm welcome and introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. As Melinda shared, I am in the United States on the East Coast in Virginia. And so it is an honor to join you for the Euro Global Women's Influencers Change Makers Conclave. Thank you for the invitation, for creating space for women leaders across sectors and across countries to reflect on leadership together. This conversation feels especially meaningful during Women's History Month. This month invites us to remember the women who opened doors before us, often in circumstances that required courage, endurance, and vision. Many of them led without recognition, support, or authority that matched their contributions. Yet their leadership changed institutions, communities, and possibilities for the generations that followed. And today we continue that work. The question before us is not only how women gain access to leadership, but how leadership itself is being shaped as women step more fully into positions of authority across sectors and around the world. That question is part of why I care deeply about this topic. My work has taken place at the intersection of leadership, spiritual care, and institutional life. Across those spaces, I began to notice that leaders are often very highly trained, deeply committed, and working under intense pressure. They make decisions that affect people's lives, organizations, and communities. Yet very little attention is given to the inner life from which those decisions emerge. Over time, that realization led me to a different question. What would leadership formation look like if we began with the inner life? And that question brings us into this question today. The title of my talk is Leading from the Inside Out: Spiritual Care, the Inner Life, and Power in Women's Leadership. So, when we talk about leadership, we often speak as though power appears only at the surface. We talk about titles, authority, responsibility, and decision making. We talk about strategy and outcomes. We talk about influence as something leaders step into once they reach a certain role. But leadership does not actually begin there. Power does not begin at the surface. It begins much earlier and much deeper. It actually begins in the inner life of the leader. Every decision a leader makes, every decision that they make is shaped by how they interpret the world. Every use of authority reflects how they understand themselves in relation to others. Every response under pressure reveals something about the inner life from which leadership action emerges. Power is never exercised in isolation. It's shaped by the inner life. This is true whether leaders are aware of it or not. So the question is not whether the inner life shapes leadership, because it does. The real question is whether leaders and institutions take responsibility for how that inner life is formed. Across sectors and cultures, women are leading in environments marked by pressure, expectation, and complexity. We're navigating organizations that are moving really quickly, respond to crises in real time, and make decisions that affect people's lives in profound ways. We're asked to be decisive and relational, authoritative and collaborative, visionary and grounded, often all at once. Yet leadership development rarely prepares leaders for the inner demands of this work. Instead, leadership development focuses on what can be measured and observed from the outside. We teach strategy, we teach communication, we teach execution. We teach leaders how to manage people, lead teams, and navigate systems. What we do not consistently teach, and hear me on this, is how to cultivate the inner life from which leadership action flows. The inner life is often treated as private. It is framed as something personal rather than professional and pushed to the margins of leadership development. It tends to receive attention only when something has gone wrong, when burnout has emerged, when conflict escalates, or when ethical concerns become visible. And this separation between leadership competence and formation of the inner life becomes most visible under pressure. When conditions are stable, skills may be enough, but what decisions carry real consequences and competing values are at stake, leaders draw on more than training. They draw on formation. They draw on habits of reflection, patterns of meaning making, and deeply held beliefs about power, responsibility, and worth. So without this formation, leaders often fall back on familiar habits. They react quickly, they try to control outcomes, they avoid difficult conversations. Power becomes something to manage rather than something to use responsibly. One moment from earlier in my leadership work comes to mind. I remember sitting in a meeting where a decision had to be made quickly. The room was tense. People were worried about consequences, about the institution's reputation, about getting it wrong. The leader at the table had authority and experience. On the surface, all the credentials of leadership were there. But under pressure, something else surfaced. The conversation narrowed, questions were shut down. What could have been a very thoughtful discussion about impact became a rush toward control. Nothing in that moment, absolutely nothing, was about a lack of intelligence or competence. It was about formation. You see, when pressure revealed the inner habits already shaping the room, the decision followed those habits. That moment stayed with me because it made something very clear. Leadership decisions are never shaped only by skill. They're shaped by the inner life leaders bring with them into the room. So for women leaders, the absence of this formation becomes especially visible. Women are frequently expected to lead with care, wisdom, and relational awareness, even within the systems that were not designed to support those qualities. We're asked to hold power differently without being formed differently. We're often expected to carry emotional labor and relational repair that institutions neither recognize nor support. When leaders are frequently, and women leaders in particular, are frequently praised for endurance while receiving little support for the inner formation leadership requires. So over time, this leaves many women leaders relying on personal strength rather than shared structures of support. Leadership becomes sustained through individual resilience rather than through intentional formation of the inner life. So if we're serious about women shaping the future of leadership, we have to take seriously this formation. Because leadership formation is not the same as leadership training. Training equips leaders with tools. Formation shapes how leaders interpret situations, make decisions, and exercise power when the tools alone are not enough. Self awareness does not emerge simply through experience. Experience without reflection often reinforces existing patterns rather than transforming them. And leaders may become more confident without becoming more aware. They may become more skilled without becoming more discerning. And self reflection is the pathway to self awareness because it requires intentional attention to the internal responses, assumptions, fears, and motivations. It invites leaders to notice not only what they do, but why they do it. Without reflection, leaders often mistake reaction for judgment. They confuse urgency with importance. They interpret discomfort as threat rather than information. And under pressure, they rely on habits formed long before they stepped into leadership roles. Leadership development often assumes that leaders already know how to discern. In reality, discernment must be cultivated. Discernment is the discipline of weighing competing values, pausing before acting, and considering the impact alongside the intention. So it requires the willingness to remain present when the path forward is not yet clear, rather than rushing toward quick answers. Ethical grounding develops in a similar way. It's not a fixed trait. It's not something leaders simply possess. Ethical grounding grows over time through practices that invite leaders to examine how they make decisions, how they understand power, and how they remain accountable to others. So, when leadership development overlooks these dimensions, leaders may know what they are permitted to do, but struggle to determine what they ought to do. Very different. Decisions may appear effective in the short term while overlooking their impact on others. So, power is not the problem. The question is how it is understood and how it is exercised. Because power doesn't create character, it reveals it, it amplifies what is already present in a leader's inner life. So, under pressure, whatever has shaped that inner life, it becomes visible to everybody. Some leaders respond to pressure by avoiding difficult decisions in order to preserve harmony. Others respond by tightening control in an effort to reduce risk. Some seek approval when what is needed is accountability. Others equate authority with dominance and mistake compliance for leadership. These patterns are not a reflection of intelligence or competence, but they reveal where formation has not yet taken place. When women leaders often encounter these dynamics in particular ways, women's authority is frequently questioned or scrutinized differently. Women are often expected to be relational without being authoritative, decisive without appearing assertive, confident without being perceived as threatening. Without formation of the inner life, women leaders may internalize these expectations. They may end up diminishing their authority in order to maintain harmony or overcompensating in ways that feel misaligned with their values. Formation offers another path. And this is where spiritual care enters the conversation. Spiritual care, as I am using the term here, is not the same as religion, belief, or personal spirituality. It is disciplined attention to the inner life that supports meaning making, discernment, and ethical grounding. It is a practice of examining the internal conditions from which leadership decisions emerge. Spiritual care strengthens leadership formation. Why? Because it creates space for reflection, interpretation, and accountability. You see, what it does is it invites leaders to examine not only what they decide, but how and why they decide. It strengthens the capacity to hold power with responsibility rather than defensiveness. This shows up in everyday leadership moments, shows up in how leaders respond when someone challenges a decision. It shows up in how they address mistakes, shows up in how they make decisions that affect people who are not present in the room. When leaders engage spiritual care as part of leadership formation, they become better able to pause rather than react. They become more willing to name power honestly, and they remain attentive to impact even when intentions are good. And this is especially important in systems where decisions carry serious consequences for those with less power. Spiritual care helps leaders remain grounded without becoming rigid, compassionate without losing authority, and reflective without becoming stuck. So, one of the least examined capacities in leadership is meaning making. Leaders are constantly interpreting events, every challenge, every conflict, every success, every setback is interpreted through an internal lens that assigns meaning. That meaning then shapes how leaders understand power and how they choose to use it. So, meaning making is not neutral. It's not. Meaning making shapes what leadership looks like in the moment. When leaders do not examine how they interpret events, they often fall back on familiar assumptions shaped by fear, urgency, and past experience. A difficult conversation may feel like a threat rather than a moment for clarity. Disagreement may feel like opposition rather than engagement. Power may feel like something to protect rather than something to use with responsibility. When this happens, leadership gets narrowed. The range of possible responses ends up shrinking. Decisions become reactive. Leaders move quickly, not because speed is required, but because slowing down feels very uncomfortable. And what spiritual care does is it interrupts this pattern. It creates space for leaders to slow down their interpretation of events. It invites leaders to ask not only what is happening, but how they are interpreting what is happening. It brings attention to assumptions that often operate below the surface. It helps leaders recognize how their history, identity, and experience shape what they see and also how they respond. Right? So this matters because leaders do not respond to reality as it is, they respond to reality as they understand it, as we understand it. Meaning making influences whether leaders experience pressure as evidence of inadequacy or as an opportunity to learn. It influences whether disagreement is interpreted as disloyalty or as participation. It shapes whether leaders feel they must carry power alone or recognize it as a shared responsibility. You see the difference. You hear the difference. Without intentional attention to meaning making, leaders often simplify complex situations too quickly. They reduce situations to right or wrong, strong or weak, success or setback. Decisions become rigid. And then leaders lose flexibility even when their values remain clear. For women leaders, this dynamic can become even more complicated. Women often lead in environments where their authority is already being evaluated closely. In these settings, interpretation can easily be shaped by external expectations rather than internal clarity. Resistance may feel like a judgment about legitimacy. Conflict may feel personal even when it reflects broader structural tensions. Women may take on responsibility for outcomes shaped by conditions far beyond their control. What spiritual care offers women leaders is a way to separate interpretation from projection. It helps leaders identify what belongs to them and what doesn't. It allows leaders to hold authority without absorbing responsibility that's not theirs. And then this leads to discernment, which we touched on earlier. Discernment is often described as intuition or instinct. In leadership, it is sometimes treated as a kind of internal certainty that appears suddenly. But the truth is, the reality is, discernment develops through reflection and meaning making over time. Discernment is the capacity to move from reflection to decision while remaining attentive to values, context, timing, and impact. It's less about certainty and more about responsibility. Discernment requires leaders to remain present when the way forward is not immediately clear. It asks leaders to stay with competing values rather than resolving tension too quickly. Many leadership cultures reward speed. Decisiveness is often celebrated, and pausing can be misinterpreted as hesitation. But what discernment challenges is that assumption. I love this because it invites leaders to slow down, not because they're uncertain, but because the moment deserves careful attention. And this becomes especially important when power is involved. Decisions made under pressure often affect those with the least authority most directly. Discernment asks leaders to consider not only what is efficient, but what is fair. It invites leaders to consider consequences beyond immediate results and to remain attentive to relational and ethical impact. So without discernment, leaders may make decisions that appear effective, but they gradually erode trust. Immediate problems may be addressed while longer-term consequences remain unexamined. And so spiritual care, it strengthens discernment because it supports the practice of reflection, awareness, and ethical grounding. It gives leaders a way to pause internally, even when external demands remain intense. It helps leaders recognize when fear, ego, or exhaustion are shaping their decisions. Discernment also helps leaders recognize when action is not the best response. Leadership cultures often assume that action always demonstrates strength. Authority is frequently associated with visible movement and intervention. Discernment introduces another possibility. It helps leaders recognize when restraint or patience may represent the most responsible use of power. For women leaders, this can be especially complex. Why? Because women are often criticized both for acting too quickly and for waiting too long. Discernment helps leaders anchor decision in values rather than in anticipated reactions. Discernment also draws attention to timing. Some decisions are sound, but premature. Others are delayed beyond the moment when they could be most effective. Discernment helps leaders sense when conditions are ready and when additional preparation is ever so needed. This capacity develops through sustained attention to the inner life. Power is relational. It moves through systems and it's expressed through decisions, through policies and practices and expectations. Leaders do not simply hold power, they participate in shaping how power operates within their institutions. So when leaders avoid naming power, it often operates without reflection. But when power remains unnamed, it becomes difficult to examine and difficult to question. So spiritual care invites leaders to name that power directly. It also encourages leaders to reflect on how authority is used and how decisions affect others. It invites attention not only to intention, but to impact. And this is where accountability enters the conversation. Because accountability is not about blame, it's about responsibility. And leaders who engage spiritual care understand accountability as a normal part of leadership. They remain willing to examine their decisions and to address harm when it occurs. Repair becomes part of responsible leadership. Some leaders worry that acknowledging harm will weaken their authority. But in practice, avoiding repair often causes far greater damage. Spiritual care helps leaders approach repair as an expression of responsibility rather than a sign of weakness. Repair requires humility, but it also requires leadership presence. It asks leaders to remain engaged when discomfort arises and to take responsibility for impact, even when intentions were good. For women leaders, repair can carry additional complexity. Why? Because we're often expected to apologize excessively or to accept blame disproportionate to their role. But spiritual care, it helps leaders distinguish between responsible accountability and self-erasure. What it does is it supports leaders in addressing harm without relinquishing authority. At this point, the importance of formation becomes clear. That leadership formation that ignores the inner life leaves leaders without the grounding needed to hold power responsibly. This is why spiritual care cannot be treated as optional. Spiritual care, it's not a luxury. It's not only a response to burnout. It is a formative practice that strengthens how leaders engage power over time. And leaders who engage spiritual care develop greater clarity, humility, and accountability in their use of power. They remain more present under pressure and more attentive to the consequences of their decisions. And this matters not only for individual leaders, but for institutions. Institutions are shaped by the inner lives of the leaders who guide them. Policies reflect priorities. Practices reflect values. Culture reflects what institutions reward and what they ignore. And when leaders are not formed for power and to exercise responsible use of power, institutions often reproduce the same limitations. So leadership formation becomes a shared responsibility. Institutions that invest only in technical skills without supporting formation risk developing leadership that appears capable but lacks depth and grounding. Spiritual care offers institutions a way to support leaders more fully. It provides language and practice for engaging the inner dimensions of leadership that already shape decisions and outcomes. So I want to make this work easier to recognize and practice. I want to introduce a rubric. The rubric that I'm offering it's not an evaluation tool in the traditional sense. It's not designed to measure performance or rank leaders. It is a formation tool, right? Its purpose is to help leaders notice patterns over time rather than focusing only on isolated moments. So, what it does is it gives leaders a way to ask better questions of themselves and of the systems that they lead. So, the first domain of the rubric is self reflection. I touched on it a little bit earlier. I'm going to expand on it a little bit more. That self reflection is the discipline of turning inward with honesty and curiosity. It is the practice of examining one's internal responses rather than bypassing them. And it does take work. Leaders who engage in regular reflection begin to notice what triggers defensiveness, what creates urgency, what evokes fear, and what brings clarity. Without reflection, leaders often move directly from stimulus to response. They react rather than pause. Over time, this reinforces habits that feel efficient, but they remain unexamined. And what reflection does is it interrupts that pattern. It slows the moment just enough for awareness to emerge. So self reflection is not about self absorption, it's responsibility. And leaders who do not reflect often, what they do is they project internal reactions onto the situations and people around them. Reflection helps leaders recognize what belongs to them and what does not. The second domain is self awareness. Self awareness grows out of reflection, but it's different. Self awareness is the ability to recognize how one's inner life shapes leadership behavior. So it includes awareness of emotional patterns, relational tendencies, and assumptions that influence decision making. So self aware leaders understand how pressure affects them. They recognize whether they tend toward control or avoidance, toward overfunctioning or withdrawal. They understand how their background and experience influence how they interpret situations. Self awareness does not remove those influences, but what it does is it helps leaders recognize when they're shaping their decisions. And the third domain is meaning making, right? That refers to how leaders interpret events, challenges, and outcomes. Leaders are constantly forming interpretations about what's happening around them, and those interpretations shape how they use power. So when leaders don't examine how they interpret events, I said this earlier that they often fall back on familiar narratives shaped by fear, urgency, or past experience. Okay. So this is very, very important. The fourth domain is discernment because that's the bridge between reflection and decision. It's the ability to move toward action while remaining attentive while remaining attentive to values, context, timing, and impact. So discernment doesn't promise certainty, but it supports responsible decision making. And what it does is it invites leaders to consider not only what decisions to make, but how the decision will be made, who will be affected, and what values are being prioritized. And it's asking leaders to remain present when the way forward is immediately not clear, rather than rushing toward a premature conclusion. The fifth domain is use of power, right? Power is often the least examined aspect of leadership. Leaders may speak about influence, they speak about responsibility and authority without naming that power directly. And so this domain invites leaders to reflect on how they understand and exercise that power. It asks leaders to distinguish between authority and control, between influence and approval, between responsibility and dominance. So leaders who attend to the inner life are better able to name that power. And then there's the practice of repair that I had mentioned. This repair is a leadership practice that is critical. For women leaders, engaging in that repair is necessary. And it doesn't have to diminish our authority. And the final domain is relational impact. Leadership doesn't occur in isolation, right? Because every decision is shaped by relationships. But what this domain invites leaders to consider is how their leadership affects others. And so relational impact, it includes attention to trust, communication, inclusion, and belonging, because it's asking leaders whether people feel able to speak openly or whether they begin to hold back. Leadership formation is always going to be incomplete if relational impact is ignored. And so leaders may achieve outcomes while gradually weakening trust. And over time, institutions feel that erosion. So all of these domains that I've mentioned, they offer a way to see leadership formation in practice because they're helping leaders to recognize where formation is strong and where it needs further attention. Centering women's leadership doesn't suggest that women lead in one uniform way. It's acknowledging that women often exercise authority within systems shaped by gendered expectations. Women leaders are frequently held to contradictory standards. They're expected to be decisive but not assertive, confident but not threatening, relational but not emotional. And so these expectations shape how authority is perceived and how a leadership is evaluated. So without formation of the inner life, women leaders may internalize these contradictions. So this is very important for us to pay attention to. Spiritual care offers women leaders practices for resisting these kinds of pressures, where they may minimize their authority to maintain harmony or overextend themselves in order to establish legitimacy. Because over time, that can lead to exhaustion and disconnection. So spiritual care supports leaders in grounding their authority internally rather than seeking constant external validation. It creates space to examine how social expectations intersect with the inner life. This is why spiritual care must be understood not only as an individual practice, but as an institutional responsibility. And lastly, as I come to the end, and this is very important, leaders are not formed within institutions that shape what is possible. Leaders are formed within institutions that shape what is possible, what's rewarded, and what is ignored. But this means that the conversations cannot stop with individual leaders. We also have to examine the systems that shape how leadership develops in the first place. Institutions often claim to value integrity, ethics, and accountability, but these values appear in mission statements and strategic plans and leadership frameworks. Yet the structures that support leaders are frequently focused on performance rather than formation. Leaders are evaluated on outcomes, timelines, and matrix. Far less attention is paid to the processes through which decisions are actually made, or to the inner conditions of that individual that are shaping how power is exercised. So when this happens, institutions unintentionally reinforce the idea that results matter more than responsibility. And what that does is it creates a misalignment. Institutions expect leaders to make ethical decisions under pressure, to navigate conflict wisely, and to hold power responsibly, yet they do not consistently invest in the formation that's required to do so. And so the inner life of that leader remains invisible until something breaks. When leadership failures occur, institutions often respond with a corrective measure rather than the formative one. Policies are revised, oversight increases, training modules are added. These responses may be necessary, but they often address symptoms rather than root causes. And what spiritual care offers institutions is a different approach. Integrating spiritual care into leadership development does not mean imposing belief systems or personal spirituality, but it does mean acknowledging that leaders are human beings whose inner lives shape institutional outcomes. And it means creating structures that support reflection, discernment, and ethical grounding as leadership capacities. And this is going to require a shift in how institutions understand leadership development. Leadership formation must be understood as an ongoing process rather than a one-time intervention. It involves creating spaces where leaders can reflect honestly, examine their relationship to power, and engage accountability without fear of punishment. And for institutions, this may involve rethinking and reimagining how leaders are supported during moments of transition, conflict, and high-stakes decision-making. It may very well involve integrating reflective practices into leadership development programs, coaching, and governance structures. It may require valuing formation-oriented work, even when it doesn't produce immediate or easily measurable outcomes. So this work is particularly important in institutions that claim commitments to justice and inclusion. When leaders have not examined how they use power, efforts to improve institutions often reproduce the very problem that they're trying to solve. And so spiritual care helps leaders examine how power operates within those systems, how decisions affect those with less authority. It invites leaders to consider not only representation, but responsibility, and for women leaders, and ultimately for every leader, male, female, institutional support for formation is critical. Women are often promoted into leadership roles during periods of instability or change, and they're asked to repair systems, manage crises, and hold organizations together without that formation-oriented support. So leaders may be left carrying disproportionate responsibility without the grounding needed to sustain it. And institutions that fail to support formation risk perpetuating cycles of burnout and attrition among women leaders. So spiritual care offers something incredible to institutions. It offers a way to invest in leaders not only as performers, but as responsible holders of power. And that is at the center of this work. That is at the heart of this conversation. Because power shapes our lives. It shapes access, opportunity, and belonging. It shapes whose voices can be heard and whose are ignored. It shapes the future people are able to imagine. And so when that inner life of ours, of each and every one of us, is left unexamined, power can be easily used in ways that damage and harm people and institutions. And so leadership formation that attends to that inner life is going to create the conditions for a more ethical, accountable, and humane leadership over time. As women, we're not simply stepping into leadership as it already exists, we're reshaping what leadership can look like. And that work is going to require more than skill and resilience. It requires formation. And spiritual care is not a retreat from leadership, it is preparation for it. So that is so important. This is an invitation. It's an invitation for leaders to take responsibility for the inner life as a site of leadership formation. And it's an invitation to institutions to invest in formation rather than correction alone. And it's an invitation to women leaders to claim authority that's grounded not in external validation, but in reflective, discerning, and ethically grounded leadership. Power shaped from the inside out changes not only how leaders lead, but how systems themselves begin to change. And this is the work before us. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much. Hello? Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Violet Wilson, for the enlightening speech today. And so there are questions from the audience. Here is the question. So, what does inner life mean in the context of spirituality?
The inner life is about self-reflection. It's about self-awareness. It is about discernment, and it's about ethical grounding. So that is what spiritual care is. It's about going inward and reflecting on what informs our decisions from the experiences that we've had in the past. So before any of us became leaders, we've been shaped by external conditions, whether it is our growing up, our home life, in school, in community. All of those interactions kind of shape and inform how we think that we should be leading. And we move into leadership roles within different institutions. And that is what's leading and guiding the decisions that we make. What I am inviting us to do is to reflect on whether the way in which we lead is effective, is efficient, creates space for others to be heard, Do we think about leadership as controlling the environment and what people think and feel? Or are we creating space for people to be heard and sharing in the responsibility of shaping the organizations that we're a part of? But in order to do that, there has to be that self-examination. The self-examination is what spiritual care is.
Thank you. Thank you so much for answering this question, ma'am. And thank you so much for joining this Day 4 virtual summit. And so there are two speakers left for this Day 4. So we have successfully completed our 3 days, and we are about to complete. There are only two speakers for this event. So thank you so much for all the beautiful ladies for sharing their inspiring and motivational presentations. And so yeah, you have a great day. Bye now.